with a packed room and a full agenda, I will give the briefest introductions, but it's my great privilege to be introducing Professor Crawford to you today. Professor Crawford is the director of the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition in London, a consultant to intergovernmental organisations such as the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the professor is someone who has been involved in the factory farming debate from the outset. You'll know, of course, that Compassion was founded in the 60s. Well, Professor Crawford was writing in the Lancet in 1968, warning on the profound impacts of factory farming, and quickly followed up in the New Scientist with an article entitled "Are Our Cows Killing Us?" I won't spoil the punchline. I'll introduce Professor Crawford to answer the question. Sir,
Thank
are
you.
our cows killing us? Please, a big round of applause.
The answer is yes. 3 issues to talk about. One is a sort of introductory issue about the reason why nutrition is important. Another is what I guess you're really interested in is the horrors of modern intensive animal industry. And the third is a sort of solution to the problem that I see as most important, which was actually, funnily enough, yesterday's Sunday Times recorded, we had a full-page article on the decline in the brain volume of the humans since the beginning of agriculture. And one of my co-workers, who we published together on evolution, has always said right from the beginning that the beginnings of agriculture, the way that it went, was the beginnings of the fall of Homo sapiens. The paper in the Lancet in 1968 was on the comparison of free-living animals compared to what we were eating at that time, 1968. And already at that time, the intensification of animal industry had led to a virtual destruction of the nutritional value of animal products. And in fact, the point I made was that human physiology during evolution would have been adapted to the nature of wild foods. I'll come back to this, but our genome's only 1.5% different from the chimpanzee, so it's quite clear that our physiology was adapted to wild foods, not to what we eat today. And so far as the essential fats are concerned, and the reason I'm interested in that is the brain is made of fat, when we looked at this issue in 1968, in the wild species, the ratio of non-essential to essential fats was about 3:1. In modern beef, the same ratio was 50:1. And the 50 was composed of all the atherogenic, thrombogenic, and carcinogenic type fats that we now know clearly, and even knew then, was largely responsible from the rise in heart disease, from a rarity at the beginning of the century to #1 killer by that date. So let me try to change your views about nutrition. Last century, the whole of nutritional paradigm was concerned with protein, calories, and growth. And that really was based, if I may say so, on knowledge gained from the animal industry, because the animal industry was promoting growth. And that spilt over into humans and the treatment of protein-calorie malnutrition. It was protein-calorie malnutrition, mark you. It was all about protein being important for growth, and Johnny had to drink up his milk because it was rich in protein, and if he didn't, he wouldn't grow. Well, now here's an example of protein and growth, because that animal weighs a ton 4 years after its birth. It gets all the protein necessary to support that prodigious velocity of body growth from the simplest food resource, namely grass. And I wonder if you can spot the big brain that this animal, this 1-ton animal has. Well, if you can't, there it is. That's all the brain that's inside the head of that massive animal. It gets all the protein it needs for body growth. It doesn't get the fats and all the other elements that is needed because it's an inland animal living on a protein-rich diet, namely grass. So I hope you're now convinced. So the brain is made of fat. 60% of its structural material is made of fat, and just as protein is required for building the body, so fats, essential fats, are required for building the brain, and especially a thing called docosahexaenoic acid. If you take modern beef and compare it with the wild, the point I made at the beginning was that our genomes adapted to the wild, not modern beef. The carcass lean of a modern beef is about 50%, and Europe brought in subsidies that would click in at 30% carcass fat. In the old days, they used to call it fat stock, not beef stock. In the wild, it's 75% and only 5% fat. Now, the lean is 4/5 water. So you take the water away, and you're left with a protein equivalent of 10 out of the 50. And the same here, you're left with a protein equivalent of 15 out of the 75. If you now look at the protein calories, you multiply by 4, so you get 40. And here you multiply by 4, and so you get 60. But if you do the same for calories, you multiply the 30 by 9, you get 270 calories, or 2 equivalents, where compared with a wild, which was only 45. So effectively, the fat-protein ratio is 6.75 times in intensively reared beef. This is fat production. It's not meat production. We're being conned by the industry. And that fat is atherogenic, carcinogenic, thrombogenic, and not very particularly good for you. It's good for making candles, but not much else. So effectively, intensification has resulted in a 9-fold increase in fat consumption compared with the animals that would have been eaten before the enclosures. So this was the introduction of the high-energy aspect of animal growth. And of course, it was the heavier the animal was, the bigger the price they got at market. So they started selecting for the fast growth of the animal. So they were starting already selecting for obesogenic animals. Then what happened, of course, you know the story. I don't need to tell you. They put them in stalls to fatten them up. They got no exercise, the muscle wasted, and they were selecting for waist gain. And then later on we invented high energy foods, antibiotics, all that kind of thing, growth promoters, and what effectively we ended up with this disproportion of a high fat carcass and a low protein carcass. Now, there's another parallel story about this, that how did we use the animals? Well, to begin with, we ate meat, liver, brain, kidneys, and intestines. We made clothes, still do, and we made candles. Then the early 20th century was still meat offal, candle, soap, leather polish. And then along comes electricity. So what happened to the candles? Hey? We eat them. That's what's happened to the candles. We're now eating them. That is a piece of wild meat, wild pig. The white stuff you see there is purely connective tissue. There's no visible fat at all. That speaks for itself. That looks like a fat animal. Now, one of the things we do in chemical pathology, or in pathology if you like, is to stain arteries with Sudan red to show up the fat deposits. So if you take a piece of meat from this animal and stain it with Sudan red, you can see little specks of fat. That's about all there is in the meat. The rest of the white is, again, connective tissue. Now, if you do this with a piece of meat you buy in the supermarket, you see the difference. That is all infiltrated fat. And this comes from the animal being put in the stalls, not getting any exercise, being had high energy feeds, obesogenic food, selected for obesity, and effectively what happens without the exercise, the muscle, fast-acting muscle fibers get lost and fat infiltrates between the fibers, and we have a wonderful name for it, we call it marbling. And they say you have to have marbled meat, has to be to give it flavor or something like that. I don't believe that for 1 second, because in fact the most expensive meat is the fillet steak, which has got very little fat in it at all. But that is the visible illustration of what happens when you intensively put an animal into a stall without access to the outside, without access to exercise, and what does the doctor tell you? You need to get exercise. You need to have a low-calorie diet. Watch your calories. We're doing exactly the opposite with these animals.